Hello, this is Anna, and we are going to start tying together some of our information on epithelial tissues and connective tissues and talk about the 4 types of covering membranes in part 8 of our histology video lecture series. All right, covering membranes. What do you need to know? Well, they are always composed of at least one layer of epithelium plus one layer of connective tissue. You can throw in smooth muscle sometimes as well, but these are the minimum that you have to have. So it's a membrane composed of 2 layers, epithelium and connective tissue. Since it is composed of 2 tissue types, it is considered a organ. Okay, so remember that from the first week and from your general biology class. So we find covering membranes forming as linings. So you can think of them as lining membranes. And they can be within the body, within a cavity, or in the lumen of a tubular organ, or they could be coating the outside of your body as your skin. Okay? We have 4 major types. There's cutaneous, mucous, which is also called mucosa, serous, which is also called serosa, and then synovial. Okay, so let's talk first about the cutaneous membrane. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this right now because we're going to do a whole lot more of this in the next chapter. The cutaneous membrane is skin. Now, the epithelium, remember, it's got to be 2 different types of tissue. The epithelium is going to be the epidermis, which is stratified squamous epithelium, okay? And then the second layer, the connective tissue, that is actually going to consist of 2 things. It's going to be a relar CTP plus dense irregular CTP. And I've already mentioned these a little bit, and we'll talk more about them next week. But we also call these regions the epidermis and the dermis. Okay? Now, something to remember is that the cutaneous membrane is pretty much our only naturally dry membrane. Some mucosas can get a little dry. We'll talk more about that at some point in time, but basically it's a dry membrane, okay? All right, now let's move on and talk about serous membranes or serosa, okay? I want you to remember the location. There is only one location, and this location seems to get messed up a lot in tests. So the location, ventral body cavity. Do not miss that on a test. All serosas are lining some part of the ventral body cavity. They are not inside organs in any way, shape, or form. Okay? Not inside organs. They are lining the ventral body cavity. All right, so I'm going to abbreviate epithelium as E, and I'm going to abbreviate connective tissue as CT. Okay, the epithelium is going to be simple squamous. And it's A and P, so we can use more than one name for stuff. It can also be called mesothelium. Okay? The connective tissue is variable. The dominant is a relar CTP. But let me see how do I want to do this. Sometimes, especially with the parietal layers, it will be a dense, irregular, and a lot of times it's just called fibrous CT. Okay? Now with the serosas, we like to talk about them in terms of having parietal serosa versus visceral serosa. All right, the visceral serosa is going to be the simple squamous epithelium and basically a relar CTP. The parietal is going to be simple squamous epithelium, and then it could be a relar, but many of them also have dense irregular because they're forming sacs. Okay? Now, this word parietal means wall. This word visceral means viscera, which means guts, which basically means your organs. Okay? So anything that has parietal is talking about the wall of something. So the parietal serosa is found on the walls of the ventral body cavity. In contrast, the visceral serosa is found around the outside of the organs of the ventral body cavity. Okay? Now, these go together. So in between the parietal serosa and the visceral serosa is a potential space. Basically means there's a gap. And I've shown this gap really narrow. It's really more like you've got a line here and you've got a line right here. They're like right up next to each other. But in it, you will find serous fluid. Okay? We do not want things rubbing in the body that creates friction, heat, inflammation. It's bad. So the serous fluid prevents friction. All right, it lets the visceral serosa slide against the parietal serosa without sticking. Okay? Now, for these, we also get special names. So we've got peritoneum, pleura, and pericardium. All right, cardium, heart. So pericardium goes around the heart. Pleura means lungs. So pleura goes around the lungs. And then the peritoneum goes around the organs. Actually, let's just erase that. We'll just keep it simple. Abdominal, pelvic cavity. Okay, so peritoneum, pleura, and pericardium tells you location. Okay, and we do have parietal and visceral pleura. Let's change the color. And we do have parietal and visceral pericardium, and we do have parietal and visceral peritoneum. And then amongst this visceral peritoneum, we've got some special types called mesenteries. And a mesentery is basically a double layer of visceral peritoneum. Okay? And then we've got two special types of mesentery called the greater omentum and the lesser omentum. Okay, let's look at a picture. All right, so right here we've got a little drawing and we've got a body cavity. And so they're showing all of this from here down to here as the ventral body cavity. And remember, this is the dorsal body cavity along with the spinal cord, okay? This is my diaphragm muscle here, so that's separating my abdominal and pelvic cavities. And then over here, this is the thoracic cavity, okay? And then this is my pleural cavity, and this is my pericardial cavity. So around the heart, let's change colors to green. So we're going to do pericardium. Around the heart, you have the pericardium. We're going to change to yellow. And around the lungs, I have my pleural, my parietal and visceral pleura, like this. Okay? And then we're going to switch back over to green. And you will have the peritoneum in here, lining the walls, but you will also have it going and wrapping, and this is going to be a little silly, but it's wrapping around all of the little organs, okay? All right, let's look at another picture. So in this picture, what we're trying to do is show you the peritoneum a little bit better. So this right here is the greater omentum. This is your transverse colon. And what I want you to do is take your hands and find your ribs. And then kind of go down until you can do just a straight horizontal line at the base of your ribs. And that's about where your transverse colon is located. The greater omentum wraps over the top of your transverse colon and then flaps down over all of your intestines like an apron. Okay, so it's covering the whole outside. That's the greater omentum. Now right here, I have some small intestines. And then this is showing you mesentery. So the mesentery is this double layer of visceral peritoneum that comes up, and it's actually going to wrap around the surface of the intestines and anchor it to the back wall so that it doesn't get twisted. Okay? Now, over on the other side, I have my liver, and I have my stomach, and again, my transverse colon, and then right there is the gallbladder. This right here is called the lesser omentum, all right? And it's just like the greater omentum. It's a double layer of visceral peritoneum. It gets a special name because it's a dominant feature, and it's always located between the liver and the stomach right there, okay? All right, let's move on and talk about mucosa. Whoops, let's not talk about mucosa yet. I've got a photograph of mesentery. So right here is colon, and then right here, that is mesentery. And you can see that it's got a lot of lovely little blood vessels going through it. It'll also have lymphatic vessels and nerves. And we'll study this more in A and P2. But basically, this is where you've got the double layer, and then the double layer separates to wrap this way and then down around the other way, so that the two layers wrap around the outside of the organ. All right, now we're gonna go on and talk about mucosa. All right, so I mentioned the cutaneous membrane, and we've talked about the serous membrane. So obviously the serous membrane is a wet membrane. Mucous membranes are also typically a wet membrane, but there are some exceptions. Okay, now what is making it wet? It's a lot of different things. So we've got various secretions from glands, digestive enzymes, the chyme that is in your intestines, saliva, blood, urine. All of those are fluids that run down the lumen of tubes. Okay, so mucosa are found lining lumens of tubular organs. Okay, now at this point in time, I'm going to make a note because your book says that mucosa open to the outside of the body. Okay? Everywhere you find that, I want you to take some red ink and I want you to cross it out and say false. Not all mucous membranes open up to the outside of the body. So examples of mucous membranes include capillaries and lymphatic vessels. If your blood vessels, so this is a blood vessel, open to the outside of your body, you would die very rapidly. So you don't want that happening. Other mucous membranes can be found like in the mouth, intestines, vagina, anus, respiratory tract, a lot of different places. And a lot of those do open to the outside of the body, okay, urinary tract. But not all do, okay? All right, so what are the tissue types? All right, so the epithelium and the connective tissue. Well, the connective tissue is easy. It's areolar connective tissue proper. And then adjacent to it, you'll have some other stuff, there might be some reticular thrown in there or some dense irregular. Now, since this is a mucous membrane, we give the areolar connective tissue proper a special name, lamina propria. You need to memorize that. It's going to be incredibly important in A&P2 so that you actually know what you're reading about. Okay? Now, the epithelium depends on the organ's function. Okay? So it could be any of them. So the bladder is lined with transitional epithelium. The mouth is lined with stratified squamous. The lungs, or the respiratory tract, is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and then ciliated simple columnar epithelium, and then and then simple squamous epithelium. And then there will be other places that are lined with simple cuboidal epithelium, and it might be ciliated simple cuboidal, or it might be microphyllae simple cuboidal. So the function determines what type of epithelium is present. Okay? And that function is also going to determine then that epithelium is going to determine what that function is. Okay? And then if you look in the notes, you'll see some more examples where I've written down what all the examples are of the different types. But let's look at a picture next. All right, so we are looking at the intestines. All right, so this is some small intestines actually, okay? The reason I like it is because it shows both serosa and mucosa. So down here I have mesentery, which is the double layer of visceral peritoneum. What's cool is you can see the layers here and here, and then you can see the blood vessels and nerves that are running through it. You can also see how the double layer splits in a single layer of visceral peritoneum wraps around the outside, okay? And then we've got various layers of smooth muscle, we've got submucosa, and then here is what we consider the mucous membrane or mucosa of the intestines. So let's zoom this up. Now remember, there's always a minimum of epithelium and connective tissue present. Sometimes we will throw in a third layer, which is smooth muscle. So here we have the muscularis mucosae, and then here is the lamina propria, connective tissue. And then here is the simple columnar epithelium. And if you look closely, you can see some little white dots, which are goblet cells. They're hard to see on this magnification, okay? So the epithelium is lining the lumen of the tube right there, okay? All right, now let's see if we can start applying all of these ideas. So, why do you want to learn about histology? It's painful, it's hard to look at, it's ugly, okay? But it has really useful aspects that you can use for diagnosing normal from abnormal. To figure out if someone has a disease, an abnormal tissue, you need to first know what the normal tissue looks like. So my labels didn't translate well, so hold on, let me write these in. All right, so those have popped in now. So we're going to look at some cervical tissue. All right, over here on this side, this is the normal manifestation. And I have this area, which is called the exocervix. And then, so this is the part that's exposed to the vagina. And then you've got the opening that goes into the uterus. This is called the endocervix. Now I want you to look at this tissue, and I want you to think about it. So we know that there's a free edge, so it's epithelium. How many rows of cells does it have? All right, now that you've said that, what is the shape of the apical cells right here? Because remember, the shape of the apical cell determines what type of epithelium it is. All right, so hopefully you're noticing that these are thin and flat. So this tissue is stratified squamous, okay? Now if we come and look at the endocervix, right here, again, how many rows of cells do you see? All right, you got it? Now what is the shape of those cells? All right, hopefully you got that there was one row and the shape was columnar. So this is simple columnar epithelium. Now what does that tell you about the function? So if it's stratified squamous, functionally, what are those cells going to be doing? All right, those are our sacrificial cells. So basically, this resists abrasion, so that if those cells get sloughed off, it doesn't matter. All right, they are meant to be sloughed off. Now, why would you want this in the exocervix? Well, the exocervix opens to the vagina, which means there is a lot of friction during intercourse. So if you had anything but stratified tissue here, when you had intercourse, you would start bleeding from the trauma, okay? Now, the endocervix, if you look at a picture of the cervix from the side, it's going to be something like this. And then it's going to widen out into the uterus, okay? And it kind of goes like this, okay? So the sperm are going to swim through the endocervix, okay? Now look at that opening. So look at this opening. Penis cannot fit. It just can't. So no friction. So it would be a waste of resources to make lots and lots of cells. Instead, you're going to put in columnar cells. Now, why columnar? Why not simple squamous? Well, you may have heard of the mucus plug. The mucus plug is thick and sticky when you're not fertile, so that nothing will go inside the uterus. When you are fertile, this mucus thins into a runny egg white consistency, and it just starts leaking out, which makes a lovely slip and slide for the sperm to swim in when you are fertile, okay? So columnar cells make and secrete. So when you are not fertile, they secrete a very sticky mucus that makes a trap. And when you are fertile, it creates a thin, runny mucus that leaks out and helps sperm enter the uterus. Okay? So that's all the normal epithelium types. Now let's look at this. This is going to be the lamina propria. So this is our areolar connective tissue proper. Now you look over here and you're going to see that the collagen fibers have gotten denser. So this looks to me more like dense irregular. Okay. All right. So we've got an idea of what our regular cervix should look like and why we have certain types of epithelium in one area versus the other. And remember that we want areolar in this area and right up against the edges here so that the avascular epithelium can still get oxygen. And we want the dense irregular because it resists tension in multiple directions. All right, and if you imagine someone giving birth, it needs to resist tension in multiple directions. All right, now let's look at the abnormal one. Okay, so I know my labels aren't great, they're a little blurry. So this is the, excuse me, that's not the endocervix. This is the exocervix. All right, now again, looking at this epithelium. So we know it's epithelium because there's a free edge. One row of cells or multiple rows of cells. All right, I know you can't see it, but those apical cells are flat. So again, we are dealing with stratified squamous epithelium right there. Okay, this is the stroma. This is not areolar. This is going to be more of a dense irregular in this area. So dense irreg, and then you'll have the areolar or lamina propria up there. Now I want you to come and look at this area. Now, if you look at these cells right here, this is the same as this, and I want you to pay attention to the way that's staining. It's staining a fairly dark purplish color, whereas over here you're seeing more of a pink stain. The epithelial cells of the mucosa are picking up the stain more than the collagen fibers of the stroma. Okay, now if we look at here, you're like, oh my god, what is that? Well, look at these. These are staining, even though you can't see them up close, you can see that they are staining the same as this, and this is epithelial cells. All right, so what's happened is these epithelial cells have migrated into the stroma, and they are now taking over the dense irregular tissue. You will also see that in some areas, the stratified squamous epithelium has thinned down to almost nothing, so that it's really more almost simple columnar or simple cuboidal, so that if a big penis came in here and rubbed against this, this would tear and start bleeding. This tissue does not have the flexibility to resist tension in multiple directions the way the dense irregular, the stroma, does. So this area, when you're having sex, would also tear and potentially bleed. This tissue does not do the function that it is supposed to do. Therefore, it is not normal. It is a type of carcinoma or cancer. It would be difficult to say that this is abnormal without knowing what the normal looks like. So we learn about the normal so that we can figure out when and why it looks abnormal. Okay? All right. That is it for the covering membranes, and the next one is going to be on the concept maps for connective tissues. And I know I probably should have done that one before this one, but I had already numbered this one, so we're just going to live with the ordering on it. So take a break and then go check out the concept map on your connective tissues.